I'd like to get into some of how you have now taken what you've identified as a challenge with child learning and been able to gamify it in a sense, right? I mean, I think that your book
Yeah.
points out a lot of really great ways that you've come up with to not only make learning fun, but as you're pointing out, to make it so that it's not just rote memory, which is so important, as you pointed out.
Like I say, one of the things that I guess because I was working with very young children initially and also children who had different learning styles, a lot of it was kind of like adapted so that it was more enjoyable rather than, I mean, you can't ask a 3-year-old to sit down and do, I guess you could ask a 3-year-old to sit down and do a worksheet, but it's not going to be very
Mm,
productive. It was everything I was kind of like learning, just kind of said, well, it adapt it into a game. And you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's common sense. Because, so for example, if we're doing times tables, when I started tutoring, I kind of like, which is what I'm doing now, I kind of, okay, so how can we take that one thing and how would the child I'm working with enjoy doing it? And so a lot of it kind of stemmed from the kids I was working with initially, and it's just kind of the ideas have grown from there. But for example, times tables is an easy one. So we would perhaps do a game of bingo. We'd perhaps play noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe, I think it's called in a lot of places around the world, where you could draw the grid with 2 horizontal lines by 2 vertical lines. And then in each square, you'd put a different number. So say we're practicing the 5 times table, and in the center square, there's a picture of a six or an image of a six. Before you can claim that square, you'd have to work out 5 times 6. Once I've given you the correct answer, I can claim it as mine with my nought or cross, and then you would have your go. And it's the first person to have a row, diagonal, horizontal line of 3. Um, we'd perhaps have a pairs game, so you've got all the cards spread out on the table, and if the first person picks up 2, and if it's a corresponding question and answer, you keep the pair and have another go. If it's not, they get put back down and the other person has a go. But the other thing is by reading it, by reading the numbers, by talking to you and telling you what my answer is, by physically moving things around, it's creating more sensory activities. So it's not as passive as well as just kind of like working through. It's like when little kids have these workbooks where you just kind of trace the letter L for lines and lines and lines, and then you start
mm.
doing letters O and you just trace it over and over. And because it's such a passive experience, you get the muscle memory. Yes, it might work in that respect, but you're not going to actually retain it as well as if it's kind of like using multiple senses. And if you're working with your children at home and you can use things like plasticine and Play-Doh and or Play-Doh
Mm.
and make a mess, or painting on big sheets of paper and things like that, again, it's becoming more sensory. And so hopefully the child's more likely to remember the information than if you
Mm.
just sit down and ask them to write out the 10 times tables 50 times. A, it's boring, they're going to get bored and not really think about what they're doing, but also it's not stimulating the different areas of the brain. And the other thing is, if you can use multiple colors, say 5 or more, again, you're creating, apparently, it opens up different neural pathways within the brain. So it again stimulates the child more than if you just keep using the same color over and over again.
Right. That's so interesting. And I think most of us hadn't really thought about that. I mean, yes, reframing it if the person doesn't understand what you're saying, as you're talking about the fact that you want to bring it in multiple ways, right? In something that touches different sensory perceptions, whether it be
Mm.
visual or tactile or hearing or anything like that, right? I think it's so interesting to think about trying to teach the same thing, but touching on each one of those different senses.
And the other thing is, I think I mentioned it in the book, the more the child enjoys what they're doing, the more willing they are that to participate. The more they participate, the more practice they get. The more practice they get, the better they become. The more confident they become, the more willing they are to participate. And it becomes a spiral of positivity, which is why if we can find things that they actually enjoy doing, the more likely it is that we're going to get that upward spiral. Whereas if we just give them worksheets and worksheets or ask them to catch a ball when they've got no coordination, no skills or whatever, it's just going to put them into that kind of like flight mode, and you're not going to get the same response as if it's something that actually they can look forward to, is a bit over optimistic, but something that they will actually kind of like tolerate doing and hopefully eventually start to enjoy it.
Yeah, I really think it's interesting that you point that out because it's often been pointed out that kids can remember sports scores who can't add two numbers together, right? You
Yeah.
know, they're terrible at
Yeah.
math, but then when they're talking about whatever sport they happen to like and what the different players on teams that they follow are doing in terms of maybe goals scored or batting averages. I know nothing about sports. That's clearly obvious right now. Um, but you know what I mean. You know, amazing how a kid who's so bad with numbers is suddenly able to rattle off, right, everything that
Yeah.
any player that they follow has done for the past, 5 years. And it's just
Yeah.
to your point that it's something that interests them. They're very interested in that sport. They're very interested in that particular player or that team. And so therefore, suddenly they don't see that as math or numbers. But when they're in the classroom, whole nother ball game.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a bit like that. I mean, I don't know anything about darts, but I know that kind of like adding some of the scores is quite complex. And if you ask the child, if you can like playing darts with a child, they could work out the score. Like you say, give them that same question in the classroom. But because one is something I enjoy and one is schoolwork, I can't do maths,
Right.
but I can work out they can like scores on the dartboard. They're one and the same, but because they're in different contexts, you can enjoy one and fear the other.